Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval universities, a recurrent topic until I think last year, because every once in a while this stuff comes back randomly. And in the first years of Schwerpunkt, actually we dealt with the history of universities. I created just recently, in fact, a playlist about that, and we have looked at them as a broader educational, but also political and social institutional. We'll see it better today, as one definitely of the greatest accomplishments of the great medieval civilization of Western culture, and beyond really, because the meaning of universities, of course, in the particular context, in fact, we were looking at, and today we will deepen, goes really beyond just the mere say educational institution per se, right? European universities in the Middle Ages weren't quite like the other, say, educational institutions that had historically existed. They concentrated an incredible amount of, in fact, knowledge, of skills, and of broader reflection on the universal and ultimately imperial ideology that reflect, in fact, the Western way to it. And we discussed, of course, the vexata question. It shouldn't actually be one of the relation between, in fact, Western knowledge and also the translation from Greek and Arabic, and how essentially the Westerners simply went picking and translating already on their own these sources from overseas during the Crusades, the maritime colonies in the Mediterranean, in a way that shows, of course, first of all, the inconsistency of many prejudices about the Middle Ages entirely, but specifically about the alleged backwardness of this broader Frankish world as Western Europe had de facto become, and that, of course, specifically in the history of universities, shows an incredible degree of autonomy, originality, if not really independence, and again, let's say unheard level. We made different videos, not just about the university as institutions per se, but for example about the revival of Roman law, juridical history. We have looked at the Bolognese juristic tradition, the Parisian theological one, and we know how they fit together with also these are the most important universities in Europe, but there are many others, Oxford, Montpellier, and more, right? Because they began to spread, right? We will make a video, and before the 13th century, of course, that today we look at just as the final affirmation and consolidation of these institutions as the peak of the great medieval civilization. But that, in fact, were contextualized in a very specific reality, politically, a reality of conflicting powers of universal scale, and thus it's unavoidable, right, when looking at their history, not to tie them to these dimensions, right? So when today we talk about the 13th century for just the aforementioned reason, this was the moment in which the university fundamentally consolidated. It was already established formally as an institution, but let's say at this point gets truly universal as a European phenomenon, right? Because it had originated just from, again, some areas, and now the 13th century, that is an age of expansion within the same Europe, naturally brings this model a bit everywhere, right? With different degrees, differences. We will see this partly today, at least in theoretical terms. Then we will make another video about saying, how did different regions differ in this regard, but they were fundamentally the same. And also, the 13th century is a moment of de-escalation, at least as far as, especially after the beginning of the century, in terms of the major universal conflict, right? This always remained there between the papacy and the empire, but it was still, first of all, always a cooperation at the end of the day. The same can be said about the new axis between France and the papacy. That we have also seen here and there, but you know what is happening fundamentally. This system, European-wise, is becoming all one. It's becoming ever more international. The 13th century is a complex century. That's the reason why we're also making these videos more in detail, because you start, say, from this moment of major expansion to the at the beginning of the century to the moment first of stagnation and a decline at the end of the 13th. So it's really a universe on its own as a century. So there are some trivial reasons, after all, why you can understand that an educational system develops, right? In this context of broader expansion, and especially from a urban point of view in the 13th century, you realize that factors like economic growth, the proliferation of money, banally, right? The social diversification had naturally increased the demand for competent men of letters that had essentially to organize, to administer, to order, to also to discipline ideologically this world. Right? We made just the other day a video about the beginning of the Albigensian Crusade, and you realize there the gigantic effort that the major European institutions made in order to maintain orthodoxy as simply the unescapable precondition of any civilizational consolidation, and through new means and through new ideas that naturally were passing through universities, together with the same conflict, right? Together with the same, let's say, presence of heterodoxy, and thus, let's say, in fact, a conflict that would fuel further civilizational output, right? Because there would be a point of stagnation as well, that it's not much just ideological per se, but or simply connected with the idea that, you know, orthodoxy wasn't challenged anymore, so it was sclerotized by some degree. But the broader, say, trend of civilizational growth or contraction that brings to, for example, the collapse, just like nowadays at the end of the great moment of great contraction, at the beginning of a moment of great contraction of enormous scale, is bringing to a scientific and moral collapse, right? And raise the need also for just keeping up with that quality by some degree. There were moments in history, arguably even the same 13th century, that were seen as moments of major crisis. Think about the 12th, the 13th, that was in the radical movements. There was a concrete risk of collapse. So you may never say, just in a posteriori, in perspective, that simply things should have gone the way they did. There are also major, of course, political reasons why things can go better and worse, and it's hardly a deterministic system there. So you can argue that, of course, universities spread from this crisis, right? As we've seen, for example, in the case of the first university of the Studium of Bologna with the Constitutio Habita by Frederick Barbarossa, just the background of the early masters, that, of course, that was fully within the, not even the wake, but properly actively and protagonistically, the investiture struggle, right? And the ideological vision of you know, the limits of power of the empire and the papacy, and how these had to be defined juridically, right? It's the same for France, right? You know, why does France eventually becomes, with Paris then in the 13th century, is the largest city in Europe, also because it's the seat of the greatest power in Europe, a theological faculty mostly, and not, say, a juridical one like Bologna. Because, of course, it was just like the cathedrals beautifully show, right, the center of a much more hierarchical power that needed that specific spiritual and ideological reinforcement, right? That was also mitigated from the above, not just emerging from the below, like say the Italian city-states. And naturally, the two levels compenetrated each other, because the 13th century being the best example of this, you see that all these institutions basically are all in one, right? And so you cannot, we'll see it better in the end, simply surpass this thing by saying, oh, it's just, an ideological need or a spiritual need. It was, all these institutions were part of the same thing. There couldn't have been Bologna without Paris and vice versa, for example. And of course, there could have been other things, or the same but in different forms. So everything is that deeply intertwined. So as we've seen, this tumultuous growth had brought princes, cities, to need for more secretaries, lawyers, doctors, right? In all mostly with administrative purposes, and that were growing increasingly more complex, and of course dependent on using the written word, which you may think, of course, was already around. And all again, these universities were coming from other educational, emerging from other educational backgrounds, cultures, legacies, and so on. So this wasn't definitely happening from, say, the universities emerging from an obscure Middle Ages where nobody knew how to read or write. It's an absolutely, insane and delusional idea of what the Middle Ages were also previous to this point. But they were an implementation, right? In a further structure on the same. The church had, for example, maintained a growing need of canonists, right? We have seen that in canon law as in civil law. Basically, the sources, right? The methods, in fact, the same scholars are shared, are very often part of the same background, and or however they constantly read everything that circulates, right? Civil and canon law could not develop at this time without one another either, right? The church by the 13th century was emerging as victorious on a universal scale, right, against other universal powers, against the heresies. So any kind of absolute counter that could say criticize the necessity of the papal monarchy. And it was also to reinforce, however, such institutional apparatus, because it had been born fundamentally just in the previous century, and of course was resting, like in this case, especially the Church of Rome, a massive cultural legacy that had always made it essentially what it had been in terms of cultural education, of scientific knowledge, and so on, because the accomplishments also of Thomistics in the 13th century are the same perfect proof that the church could handle a complete restructuring of the educational sources as far as especially natural science was concerned, to make them collimate with the broader universal meaning of the scripture. So it's just a civilizational output of unprecedented scale, right, in such a short amount of time, and also in terms of again original interpretations and other accomplishments, really unique historical. As we've seen, universities had, of course, emerged within the city, right, and much of this stemmed from the need to counter heresy that had been spreading mostly from the cities. So the integration of the Pauperistic-Evangelical movements in the Church of Rome So that's the need of having educated preachers that could address the new urban social estates and affirming not just orthodoxy but also a particular type of interaction between the faithful and the church, and so also having the papacy acquiring new means, for example, to control the same dioceses through, in fact, the mendicant orders were often also in competition with them, emerges through universities, because the mendicants are educated, at least, those who were meant, in fact, to teach the others in places like Paris itself. It was very new, right? There were lots of experiments regarding this, because the monks traditionally were to just study their own rule and practice in it, and yes, of course, they collected manuscripts that were very educated sometimes, but this is a completely different thing. There you have probably even the surpassing of the monastic practice as it had been traditionally established into sending these friars in the world, right, and still maintaining spiritual standards accordingly, which is very courageous and somehow necessary, because just the world was essentially structuring itself that way, and you couldn't be late, right, in catching up with these changes. And that's why, in fact, the traditional academic systems proved to be insufficient and unsuitable, right? Universities had already proven this in the 11th, the 12th, and now the 13th century. There was also a degree of autonomy that was opposed to such hierarchical management of the university. In fact, the same concept of universitas was starting from the habitual guild kind of corporative, associational community practice of the Middle Ages. Every community was actually known at the time as universitas. So we eventually came to designate with the term university the specific educational institution, but it was pretty much the same. These were just the etymology, of course, comes from universis, which in Latin means directed towards a single purpose, right? So that's also what universal in general means. That, of course, is that purpose is the truth, right? Is the absolute authority, reason, discipline, and so on. It was already part of the entire traditional and Christian worldview. It couldn't be different, right? Just at this time, the blossoming of different communities brings to the necessity of the aforementioned specialization. And as you know, universities very often were born autonomously, right? Eventually, and especially from this time onwards, you have the papacy, the empire, other European rulers that fundamentally confer universitary rights, right, of studium properly to these centers, these institutions. But these had already been born, right? At that point, it was mostly just preferring some communities over others, and or some communities within the same universities. As you know, very often they were divided in national groups. We have talked about how universities work internally. We will see it better at some point. But again, you have a playlist if you're interested. And this had caused schisms. There were some important universities that were born out of these kind of purges, moving from, say, a city to another, or at least a part of the students. So it was really a very free movement in many ways, because by the 13th century, you just don't have, of course, the coercive capacities of a contemporary state. So it's a problem to control ideas, which is an absolute need of any civilization worth of this name, because we constantly control ideas. We constantly, just by stating something or not doing it, we actually control, we have an impact on anything, right? So, of course, the higher institutions had to maintain some standards, and they had to make sure that these communities would not be, say, hotbeds of harbingers of heresy, or kind of we'll see it better now, because it happened exactly at the highest level of learning as well, because that's eventually the most dangerous thing. Like if there is a peasant in the countryside who believes still in something pagan-like, who the hell cares about that, right? It's completely useless to try to eradicate. First of all, because they still thought they were Christian, but secondly, because they didn't have any cultural capacity to make a difference, as opposed to the great universal institutions. And thus, if the university, like the one of Paris, becomes, heterodox, or at least the church hasn't yet developed the capacity to check the teaching, even some private kind of ideology spread. It's quite complicated to manage wolfing, because it impacts secular authorities that, of course, must need that orthodoxy in order to make things work. We've seen this many times, even in other realities. I mean, in the caliphate and so on. The patterns are somehow always the same at the core. So this is the point. Remove from your mind the idea that there was a terrible authority was oppressing and preventing ideas to spread in the way we intend, because the same people who spread different ideas were thinking exactly the same thing on their own at the time, and the spiritual and temporal powers were absolutely cooperative in this. So it wasn't a matter of national or kind of, in fact, secular versus ecclesiastical thing. It was just a matter, in fact, even the investiture struggle was still about recognizing each other, but what each other's prerogatives were, and not absolutely never sticking to kind of a heterodoxy. There is no such thing in the West. You have also to appreciate this in a broader cultural awareness of what is the right path to follow, and eventually orthodoxy won, right? And even the big crack of the Reformation occurred a good 2 centuries after the major medieval civilizational crisis, which tells you how deeply hinged these ideas were in traditional Europe. But we'll talk about it on another occasion. The urban estates that were expanding of course, had needs on their own. I mean, first of all, they wanted just to learn, because it was a way to make a living, right? That's how literally universities had been born, and we've seen this in some detail. But this entailed solidarity between peers, the exchange of ideas, open discussion. Also, of course, a recognition of the value of their work, which, from a postdoctoral point of view, is quite interesting as well, because they needed, of course, space for their intellectual work and also personal effort, right? So as spontaneously as they had born, universities were obviously functioning. Then there is a greater authority that comes over them and says, wait, what are you doing here? Or I want to profit from it in some way. So this was a struggle and a conflict between institutions as well. In this sense, it was the universities as well that, just as the universal powers, had to adapt to the situation. And also, of course, what the people wanted. I mean, the flourishing of universities, as we said before, also entailed a competition between the same universities. So it's important from a historical point of view to realize that everything happens within a context. It's never separated from the world. Even if didactically speaking, you talk about universities in general, and you think there is the university somewhere, people doing stuff, and that's it. No, it's much more. It's a community that is squeezed, compressed among many others, and is constantly adapting to the situation as well. So, as you understand, if there is normally a polarized political situation, you have, one side, another, and within the same institution, there is always the the possibility of a shift, of a change, and that is what the greater, say, authorities, powers are essentially also investing in, right, to tip the balance practically. And there is also another point, like why were certain places, right, the seat of important universities and others not, right? For Paris, you kind of understand it because it was the largest city in the West at the time. But why Bologna or Montpellier or Oxford? Because it's not so readily apparent why, right? Of course, they had all a history you can brutally approximating, say that, of course, telling the history of this thing, you can argue that there were many cities that were of the same or even greater importance than these ones, right? So this requires a very in-depth analysis, and sometimes we don't really know, right? Or at least, you need somebody to carry out a research why this place was specifically chosen, because sometimes, it was, again, a spontaneous aggregation, why it's kind of one center prevailed over another. It's not entirely clear, right? It could have gone differently, and we don't have sources literally telling us directly, because you wouldn't understand it clearly even today, right? Why do you think that certain universities are better than others? There can't be a huge debate about that, right? At the time, however, it was somehow more evident because these centers were undoubtedly the most important. And of course, their development dates well before the 1200s that we're seeing today. We can, however, see what the situation was at the beginning of the 13th century in France, for example. So Paris is fundamentally the capital, right? It's de facto has become the capital of the Kingdom of France, that has achieved this dramatic results of bringing back again all the territories of the old Western Frankish kingdom under the Capetian monarchy. Thus, the theological studium of Paris is also the mean of irradiation of the northern French hegemony over the rest of the country. And if we look at King Philip II Augustus' entourage, we realize that we're just a handful of magistri after him, right, following him. And when you look at the broader French high clergy, that is to say the bishops and canons, you realize that only a 10 to 20% were actual masters, right, and taught at university. In England, for example, this figure, the last figure, is double, right? It's around 20-40% of the high clergy that is also teaching at university. And this may have to do with different political and social mechanisms, of course, such as the fact that France was much more highly stratified, basically, than any other country at the time. Even if England was a feudal monarchy herself, the traditional type of rule of the monarchy over the country, for how you had form, also territorial, was significantly different. Was just also more centered, properly in England as a whole. While France was now a group of different countries de facto that were to be brought together under this rigid authority to stick together, and thus there was also a more elite hierarchy holding the whole thing, and for more people, right? But it's not necessarily the same thing. The question is also how much the university autonomy was functional to preserve the institutional, in fact, liberties of the same, or actually being instrumental to the establishment, ideologically, educationally, nor for those administrative reasons we've seen before, right? And some historians want to stress the intellectual side of the story, right? Because it's easy, especially after the Enlightenment, etc., to pretend that university was just an expression of some sort of unhinged science and intellectual enthusiasm of the scholares, not even of the magistri itself. This is an important interpretation because there is no doubt that in these centuries the intellectual accomplishments had been massive, and that the universities had been born with that typical traditional spirit of free association that, as we've seen, was at the base also properly of the entire political institutional structures of the kingdoms, the reason why these powers existed in the first place juridically, and that the definition of that order did pass through universities themselves, right? However, the point that just joining a university in order to escape the control from for example, the ecclesiastical, but also the lay authorities, and dedicating themselves freely to the quest for truth is debatable, right? First of all, because again, our concept of free thinking is, aside from completely unrealistic and delusional per se, but for how they wanted us to swallow it at least, but it's just not the one they had at the time, because they were, as we said, much more aware of the necessity of an objective morals, much more than we are willing to accept today, right? And it is true that definitely at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, especially the Aristotelian philosophy, with the the translations of the physics, the metaphysics, the ethics of the Hellenic philosopher. In fact, we can't say scholar himself, but had represented an important change, properly in the way of making science the same theology in many ways. And as you know, part of the reason is that, by the way, this was not just plain Aristotle, right? Famously enough, it was a mediation through the Arab commentators, first Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, if I pronounce it correctly, that had added something on their own, right? Something especially also from far away as the Persian tradition. There was a lot of Platonism also connected with it, ironically. And this arguably conferred also a greater, as it had happened in Islam, a greater, capacity of including these ideas within the corpus that had already been consolidated. In fact, in Europe, mostly on the basis of a Neoplatonic philosophy. But as you know, it did create lots of problems because it was evident, as we were saying in the beginning, that already by the 12th century, European schools had been using the Aristotelian logic without difficulty. So they were smart. They knew what it was about. They already knew what the philosophy was. They knew how to translate Greek and Arab independently. They were going literally to pick the manuscripts in places that they weren't even studied, like they were being studied in Europe. So something completely opposite to the story that, again, Islam or the Byzantine Empire somehow civilized the West. It's in many ways actually even the other way around, especially starting from the 12th century and definitely by the 13th. But in any case, this had produced some issues in Europe, because the assimilation of Aristotle's philosophy entailed a very different approach to, especially, as you know, physics, right? And as far as ethics was concerned, talking about physics and metaphysics, of course, but there were some points of contact also with tradition from Aristotle. So now you don't have to compare Plato and Aristotle, but as you know, Aristotle is somehow a more, first of all, it's a newer philosophy, and he represents a bit that kind of further rationalization of thought from the traditionally kind of just mostly transcendental based one that, of course, was the product of a great civilization, the Hellenistic one. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, so we are in times and places where really much was changing and had changed in the same Hellenic world as far as the individual participation to, for example, in fact, the sacred was much reduced. And so the greater concern for the church was not much just, Aristotle may say something particularly antagonistic compared to most of the Platonic-based philosophy the Christians were using, that at the time they thought, by the way, was Plato, but actually was Neoplatonism, was Plotinus. It's just in the 15th century that you would find out that that was not Plato, but essentially a late antique philosophy. It was still based, of course, on a broader principle that Platonism was, of course, comprehending. The problem was not that. The problem was not even perhaps just the realization that Aristotelianism was conflicting with the, let's say, a more transcendental approach to reality, not just a mechanistic or naturalistic or rationalistic one, because they're part of the same, they're just two different perspectives on the same thing. What really matters, as the church would prove itself, is how you're able to to reconcile them, but especially how much force you put in the interpretation of the world, which is arguably what did surely shrink in starting from the late 13th to 14th century. It's a bit like what happened in the ancient world, right? There is a constant aging that can hardly be reinvigorated or rejuvenated, because these civilizations were really expanding also as far as the wealth of the people as a whole was concerned. So the necessity of struggling is, say, if you read Dante, you realize that there is much already of that fatigue of that civilization to actually investigate what properly the original tradition was about, right? And something that the same Christianity had been embodying, as far as properly the loss of say, not just of the knowledge, but of the aptness, right, to achieve certain enough. I mean, this is not to discuss now, but the reason why Christianity spread is actually pretty coherent with what was going on at the time where it happened, and it's hardly something you can blame on Christianity, but you have to spot in the general collapse of the people, and in a millenary perspective, as much as just Hellenism was just something very different from the archaic times of Rome or before. So much of a civilization is how much it manages to combine tradition and modernity to be powerful, and so to earn the divine imperium, right? And there is no doubt that 13th century Europe was booming in this regard. And after great booms, there are often great contractions as well. So it's wholly normal, but at the same time, in a linear way, the broader knowledge goes lost anyway, or at least the capacity of accepting that direct experience with the sacred that is growing ever more distant. It's just today's times also confirm in a broader sense, even though we do have power and we do have the capacity to wield it, and that's definitely a traditional element, even if people who use it do not realize it or do not understand it. And in fact, also much of the alleged traditionalism today is just actually a superstitiously infernal and anti-traditional self-sabotaging of traditional elements that even modernity bears, and that you're of course not able to recognize because they're just the lowest product of the same modernity, not the best one. In any case, as you know, and we've seen this also in that video about the Joachimites recently that happened at the end of the 13th century, but especially at the beginning of the century, the big thing were the condemnations launched in Paris in 1210, 1215 against the teaching of especially the natural philosophy of Aristotle. Because again, the idea was that behind it was too much mechanism that would just explain how things work without the necessity of mankind to step and kind of simply retake control of the world without having to be just looking at a distance of how, or theoretically how things work, right, per se. So distancing from heroism that still entails that knowledge, right? So Thomism, as later the church would accept, as you know, the Aristotelian ideas and adapt them, would be pretty clever and an astonishing accomplishment that reveals all the power of the civilization. But at the time was understood that it was dangerous as well, and it's just when they realized they couldn't stop it because the people would have studied this stuff anyway and they were not capable of holding to kind of an orthodox standard anymore through it. They decided to integrate this, but making it work together with the Bible and also part of Platonism. In any case, this condemnations were launched against the very first masters of the West. For example, David of Dinant, who dared to even comment upon it, again, as a university master, and illustrating in the process also how much awareness of the consequences of these actions and the studying of these philosophies were understood at the time. This arguably by the end of the 13th century was already not forgotten, but at that point the church had somehow accomplished this, the capacity of controlling at least the matter as it was being taught. And so people said, well, then it's kind of okay, and the church's response would be, yes, it's okay because we have certified the way which you have to study this. But the point lays beyond, right, that you can't simply think that understanding how the universe works mechanically is enough, right? It's not just knowledge, right? It's just not awareness. It also takes something more spiritual, right? Something more Platonic that must forcibly be combined with the Aristotelic aspect and not just focusing on it. And arguably, the consequences of this is the rejecting of tradition in the end, right? It's just today's radical materialism that basically science has become, right? Not because you cannot, of course, spot much else, right? And studying moral forces is particularly complicated, but exactly because the latter entails a process that goes beyond at least just the materialistically based view of science. And it's not about, thinking that there are ghosts around and that saying, well, I don't see it, so we can say there are. That's not what, again, in fact, this ideologies had wanted to make you believe. That is to say, if you basically believe in God, you're just an idiot, while other people without basically any education, but just claiming that, since science says so, it would be a kind of a civilizational accomplishment. No, that's exactly the destruction of the true meaning of science, right? And the rejection of the man potential as far as a transcendental spiritual dimension is concerned. That is based on action. It's not based on contemplation. You need the two, right? It's gotten to contemplation and that's why people entrench in materialism, because they're scared personally not to be enough, right, to dare knowing or simply to do more, right? That's the same reason why I'm a great science fan, right? I would never deny it because I believe that it all makes particularly sense, but only if you study it together with what we know beyond science, which hardly any scientist does today, sticking just to the materialistic side of the story. So treating essentially religion as a fairy tale and not what it means actually in a pretty... Actually, what we found out scientifically, neurocognitive sound dimension, as we reconstructed it, and that is just simply refusing it because it cannot be quantified as a moral dimension. Literally, we know that life exists. Can you quantify life scientifically? You can't, because again, if you stop simply from a material point of view, you should even deny that life exists, because outside from the mechanistic, materialistic side of the story, you shouldn't be able to accept that what is going on is real just because you can't quite say it's there. So you can even claim that life exists practically, right? You must make that leap of faith to accept that this is the situation, and that's exactly that one that is being forbidden for very specific ideological fourth estate, statalistic, collectivistic, nationalistic, and socialistic reasons. So essentially the abortion of the dignity of mankind and of any person and of any culture and of any morals. Well, congratulations. Things are much more complicated. In any case, it is true in part that in the 13th century, universities were, let's say, a possibility for those masters who wanted to abandon those institutions essentially ruled by local authorities who wouldn't allow them to research or teach, say, novelties and, say, ideas that eventually would have success if they had a purpose, of course, civilizationally, and that's also why the church and the other, and the other powers accepted these ideas as well. But what you see in the 13th century, especially after the successful repression of the heresies throughout all this chronology, is not like, for example, what happened during the Reformation, but you literally have some powers that bail out, right, from properly the Catholic idea. So, of course, the necessity of the universal empire and of the also necessary realization of the potential, the divine potential of mankind, so actually the importance of the works. As far as salvation is concerned. Right here in the 13th century, we have, fortunately, a ruling orthodoxy that ruled, again, on the single most impactfully civilizational moment of medieval history, and arguably one of the greatest in the history of mankind, but actually not even arguably. And that expressed the success of that same elite, that same establishment. The 13th century is the triumph of what essentially the traditional establishment had been about, since especially say from the most hierarchically organized, so the civilization, most civilized side of the story in Europe. Another interesting level to be considered here is the one between the masters and the students, right? Because universities, as we just said, are complex systems. They are not just univocally working. You don't have a single spirit among the masters, but you don't have a single spirit among the students. There are parties, divisions, different interests, just like today. Just think at university, how do you see your professor? It's not just somebody who stays there and that makes the thing for you. There are many interests, there are many different ideas, and there are probably differences in intelligence. And so all this counted at the time as well. Surely there is a self-awareness of the institution per se. It's not wholly permeable, otherwise they would have not even created it, or it would have ended up controlled by somebody else, at least wholly. However, we realize that the scholars per se would have not been enough alone to give birth to universities historically. There undoubtedly was a feudal, let's say, laxity whenever universities emerged, most of the time. Like, this was a moment in which feudalism was at its peak, but the system was expanding so fast that some of its authority had not been shared just by the old feudal establishment. So, of course, cities would become part of that broader hierarchy. Again, they weren't oppositive to it just per se, right? This still made, as we've seen, the intervention of external authorities necessary in the process of growth, of expansion, of regulation, and so on. Right, so there was a great power restructuring during the 13th century that started exactly from the universal powers, that entailed necessarily the work of the universities as much as their control. It's a double thread connection. And this, of course, reflected the development also of non-universal powers that, however, would never consider themselves as outside of the universal power itself, as not even outside of the framework of Christendom, for example. So all happened in substantial harmony with Rome. There is no, even conflict was fuel for consolidating the system, and not, necessarily in an oppressive sense. The universities participated to this themselves. Right, they created an establishment that extended its control over essentially the other associations than the ones of masters of students, because you need standards too, right? So you can achieve more if you allow, of course, for competition to occur within still some measures that otherwise would make the quality sink per se, right? Not just what is spontaneous is actually successful, right? It can't just happen in moments of boom, actually out of just, some kind of unregulation. This is very relatable to these times just because they emerge, but they don't actually produce much civilizational capacity. Maybe altogether they have a role, but those same energies invested in it could be in fact, regulated better, right, to make something more solid last. This ensured the same survival of the universities as well, which were an institution that still exists today, de facto, unvaried, right? There was an important support given to them, for example, by the French kings, as in the example especially of Paris, but also of Montpellier, that embodied the most important Occitanian studium, and so it was quite ideologically functional to the assertion of the Capetian monarchy in such a wide territory, right up to southern France. Montpellier was also supported by the King of Aragon originally, which had an interest of essentially similar nature, right, maintaining kind of foothold in Occitania until basically the French took over all the thing. Oxford, of course, was openly supported, and probably in the best way, perhaps, in terms of direct connection by the English king as such, right? It became just a true point of reference. And England, from an institutional point of view, was already much more compact, right? London was a much older, proper capital, even in Paris, like Westminster, properly developed, even since pre-Norman times, towards properly, it had a chancery, permanent one, the English king, it was just much more the center of a borough that was working for the entire hierarchy that was, of course, connected mostly with the center. It is true that England was somehow, a smaller, less inhabited country. There was essentially no other big center of the scale of the largest in Europe out of London, right? So it was easier to centralize in a way, but still, this had a benefit. Still, for the further development in relative terms over others, the popes they were triumphing during the 13th century, supported dramatically university development. Innocent III, Honorius III, and Gregory IX are the greatest names, but as you know, further on, even Rome will have her university founded by Boniface VIII, exactly at the beginning of the 13th century, and we're in the wake of that same great 13th century civilization and papal tradition at the end of the day. All this had a purpose, and so interests connected, right? It was important in this forest of communities, of communes, of universities, of princes, vassals, and so on, to put an order, right, to favor one side rather than the other. Imagine that these are all conflicting with one another. So if you don't, in order to make one emerging, you don't have to fund them from the base, right? It's just enough to, again, tip the balance so that you can make it emerge, and then if the thing becomes too risky, you can simply take away support, and the thing will re-equilibrate itself just through the competition of those elements. Naturally, you are not out of such competition yourself in general, but say universal authorities, so in fact emperors, popes, and kings also sometimes, as more national ones of course, were the greatest certifiers of university standards, right? There was a series thus of statutes, privileges conferred even to nascent centers. Right, the church was quite attempted, for example, not to, let's say, make such centers inclined towards secularization per se, both ideologically, but also because, for example, they were within the papal states, and the fact at this point they could receive these privileges as essentially subjects of the papacy in some way. The masters and students remained clerics in that case, submissive to ecclesiastical jurisdiction too. That's another point, that who does rule over, because what do these rights actually mean? You give them these rights and then it's all. No, you give them those rights in exchange for regulating the community. And thus, of course, you can appeal to, say, the emperor, say, I don't know, we feel the papal pressure too much. Can you do something about it? And vice versa, by the way. And so there would be a competition over the same university, right? But just to make an example of these more papally controlled ones, it was a pontifical delegation that allowed the chancellor to confer the degrees to the students. So it was always like, if there was some hothead who denied, as it would happen only in the 14th century, like even the right of the papacy to exist in the first place, as some were doing with the emperor from the papal side, they wouldn't be accepted in the institution that was supporting them, of course. And this, what is important about this is that it's not, there isn't like an established order already about certain hierarchies, like they're being formed now. So the way you analyze, you study, you research, and you teach law, for example, is deeply connected with, for example, the concept of the investiture. So universal rule and more, because you practically control eventually what the same communities will expand like, thinking what, right, and asking the support of whom accordingly. The papacy expected its own universities to serve it directly by guaranteeing orthodox teaching, thus, and furnishing the jurists and the theologians needed for the Pope to pursue, in keeping with the Gregorian reforms, his policy of making reforms and centralizing power for the papal monarch. However, right, and this is why they succeeded as a civilization, the papacy recognized incredibly well the circumstances. We've seen it very well in the videos about the mendicant orders and how they became effectively the detainers of the greatest and the highest education in Europe, from literally being mendicants in the streets. And the papacy managed to channel these forces, managed to even make them explode further or reviving their influence, right, by giving them something to live for, which is important because again, the papacy had won its place with that level of temporal power just by the 12th century, de facto, at least at the same scale of the imperial one. So the thing is, relatively new when it happens relatively, in fact, in a short time, but also in a time that when this order was consolidated and would again last for other centuries, right? So unity was something that did work, that provided with an alternative. If you were instead from just imperial side, which was technically, say, more complicated, especially in the 13th century, because the empire would basically sink, whereas the French, that, as we've seen, had also the monopoly on theological education, at least the highest one, were necessarily so also because of the support of the papacy. So the 13th century was just a moment of great also ecclesiastical rule, hegemony, organization, right? And it paradoxically founded great part of what we call the cultural modernity, that, as we were saying before, just allowed some very good standards, but people just to soften up on them, and thus abandoning the same tradition that had founded them, right? And so founding the universities, supporting them, endorsing them, and also just financing, for example, their programs, their teaching, and the teachers and so on, meant to also, meet with some requirements that at the time, especially in the 13th century, were really and deeply thought as, being a necessity for Christendom, as the triumph over the heresies and heterodoxy had beautifully showed, right? So the order, the establishment was well founded at this point, and it worked functionally to develop onto these moral resources. Also, great part of the aforementioned, for example, modern bureaucracy is not born in the 18th century. It's a papal Angevin creation, fundamentally, in the 13th. And we're talking about, again, standards that did not exist practically anywhere else. Perhaps the Byzantine Church was so well administered, like just some modern, before the modern standards of bureaucracy arrived, but in the West you find, actually suspect, even more advanced standards comparatively, and in the rest of Europe there weren't, or at least they were forming in different ways, but this properly universal dimension that goes beyond the single reigns and their administration is a product again of the Papal Angevin alliance here, and that supported an extraordinary. This is not just about the university. This is about everything. It's about civil development again, law, but also art. Also, and this is again the peak of medieval civilization in terms also urbanistically, architectonically, and more. And it forcefully needed such order to be enforced to eventually bring, in the moment of the crisis, this system not to fall, but just to remain standing until the fall of the Ancien regime, and practically, at least as far as the Catholic dimension is concerned, but the institutions were the same, right? As the base, they functioned essentially as they had been based at this point, also from just from a lay civil point of view, right? And more, even in banking, in many other, say, fields, right? So I think for today, just a broader look at this universitary expansion in regulation and control, we can stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.